Smoke visible for 300 miles, 1 million corpses processed with industrial precision, libraries containing the sum of human knowledge reduced to ash in hours. February 1258. The unstoppable Mongol war machine meets the unmovable center of Islamic civilization. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, brings Chinese engineers and 40 siege weapons to the gates of Baghdad. The Caliph, spiritual leader of Islam, believes God will intervene. One understands physics, the other trusts faith. In 13 days, the question is answered in blood, not with massive armies clashing on open fields, not with heroic last stands, but with something more terrifying, systematic, emotionless annihilation. How did the jewel of Islam fall faster than any Mongol target in history? What terror did this unleash across the Muslim world? Let me take you to the killing ground where empires learned that some symbols, once broken, can never be restored. Baghdad was the center of the world, and everyone knew it. 1 million people called it home in an age when London barely reached 40,000 souls. The market sold silk from China, spices from India, amber from the Baltic, gold from Africa. 500 years the Abbasid Caliphate had ruled from these walls, longer than Rome's Western Empire, older than any European dynasty. This wasn't just a city. This was the beating heart of Islamic civilization, the place where faith met scholarship, where the Quran's verses shared shelf space with Greek philosophy and Persian poetry. The House of Wisdom stood as monument to what humanity could achieve when knowledge mattered more than conquest. Scholars from 3 continents gathered in its halls to translate, debate, discover. They mapped stars with precision Europe wouldn't match for centuries. They solved equations that would later be called algebra. They preserved Aristotle and Plato when Christian Europe was burning books. Conservative estimates place the library's holdings at 400,000 manuscripts, scrolls, and codices, each one copied by hand, each one irreplaceable. But here's what your history teacher never told you. While Baghdad reached toward the heavens with scholarship and art, its walls were crumbling. The fortifications that had turned back siege after siege in centuries past now showed cracks wide enough for a man to thrust his arm through. The garrison that once numbered 50,000 disciplined warriors had withered to perhaps 20,000, many of them untrained, poorly equipped, led by commanders who owed their positions to family connections rather than battlefield experience. Caliph al-Mustasim sat on the throne of the faithful, and he was the wrong man in the worst possible moment. Not cruel, not stupid, but fatally disconnected from reality. His advisors told him what he wanted to hear. God would protect the holy city. The Mongols would never dare attack the spiritual center of Islam. Divine intervention would scatter any army foolish enough to approach. Al-Mustasim believed them because belief was easier than facing the mathematics of military power rolling toward his gates. The Mongol Empire had consumed half the known world, and they were just getting started. From the Pacific to the gates of Europe, no force had withstood their revolutionary warfare. They didn't just defeat armies. They erased civilizations so thoroughly that historians still argue about where some cities once stood. Samarkand, jewel of the Silk Road, population 200,000. After the Mongols left, fewer than 50,000 survived. Nishapur resisted for 3 days. The Mongol commander's wife died during the assault. Every living thing in the city was killed in revenge. Even the cats, even the dogs. The skulls were arranged in pyramids that travelers reported seeing decades later. Merv, the largest city in the world before the Mongols arrived. 700,000 souls. The Mongol general promised mercy if they surrendered. They did. He killed them anyway, methodically, over 13 days. Then he sent men back through the ruins to kill any survivors hiding in the rubble. This wasn't warfare. This was extinction made policy. And now they were coming to Baghdad with something worse than rage. They were coming with purpose. Hulagu Khan was not his grandfather Genghis, though the blood ran true. Where Genghis exploded across the steppe like a storm, Hulagu moved like a glacier, slow, patient, crushing everything in his path with cold inevitability. He had crushed the assassins in their mountain fortresses, strongholds that had laughed at every army for 2 centuries. He did it with siege engines hauled across mountains that should have been impassable, with engineers who understood leverage and trajectory better than the defenders understood prayer. Munka Khan, the great Khan ruling from distant Karakoram, had given Hulagu a mission that made other Mongol commanders pale. Break Islam, not just defeat it, break its spirit, destroy its centers of power so thoroughly that resistance would seem futile for generations. Baghdad was the prize, the symbol, the heart that needed stopping. By January 1258, Hulagu's forces gathered like a noose tightening. 150,000 warriors, possibly more. Accurate counts were impossible, but scouts reported Mongol camps spreading for miles around the city. These weren't just horsemen from the steppe. Hulagu had brought Chinese engineers who could build siege weapons that made European trebuchets look like children's toys. He had sappers from Persia who understood how to undermine walls and divert rivers. He had veterans who had done this before, in a dozen cities, and knew exactly how the screaming would sound when it started. The letter arrived at the Caliph's palace on January 29th. Hulagu's terms were written with the kind of clarity that comes from absolute confidence. Surrender now. Open your gates. Submit to Mongol authority. Do this, and the city would be spared, its people allowed to live as subjects rather than corpses. Resist, and Baghdad would join the list of names that mothers whispered to frighten children into obedience. Al-Mustasim read the letter and made the fatal calculation of the deluded. He believed his own propaganda. 500 years of Abbasid rule couldn't end because some horseman from the east demanded it. God wouldn't allow the center of Islam to fall to infidels. The very idea was unthinkable, and what is unthinkable need not be prepared for. His refusal was delivered with the kind of arrogance that history remembers. The Caliph suggested that Hulagu reconsider his threats, that attacking Baghdad would unite the Muslim world against him, that divine protection surrounded the holy city like an invisible wall stronger than stone, that perhaps Hulagu should think very carefully about the consequences of defying God's chosen ruler on earth. Hulagu received the response and smiled. He had heard this before. Every doomed city said something similar in the days before its walls came down. Faith was admirable, but faith couldn't stop a 200-pound stone traveling at terminal velocity. The encirclement was completed by February 1st. Mongol camps ringed the city in every direction, their cooking fires visible from the walls like a constellation fallen to earth. The siege engines arrived piece by piece, hauled by oxen, assembled by engineers who worked with the precision of men who had done this so many times the process had become routine. Massive trebuchets, counterweight models that could hurl projectiles weighing up to 300 pounds, smaller mangonels for precision strikes against specific wall sections, covered rams to approach the gates under protective shells. But the real genius was in the water. The Tigris River flowed through Baghdad, the city's lifeline for drinking water and trade. Hulagu's engineers studied the river's course, the floodplains, the defensive ditches the city's defenders had dug, expecting to slow any assault. Then they began digging their own channels, upstream dams to divert water, downstream channels to flood the approaches from specific directions. They turned Baghdad's geography against itself, drowning the defensive positions while leaving Mongol siege engines on high ground. Inside the city, panic began to spread like plague. The markets that had buzzed with traders from 3 continents fell silent. Refugees from surrounding villages had flooded through the gates before the siege closed, bringing stories of Mongol efficiency that made veterans pale. Some people began digging hiding places in their basements. Others gathered valuables, hoping somehow to buy mercy from men who had more gold than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. A few wise souls slipped through the Mongol lines under cover of darkness, choosing exile over whatever was coming. The garrison prepared with the desperation of men who knew they were overmatched but had nowhere to run. Arrows were counted and distributed. The walls were inspected for the 100th time, their cracks suddenly looking like fatal wounds. Commanders who had never fought anything more dangerous than bandits tried to remember tactics from books they'd skimmed years ago. Young men who had joined the guard for steady pay rather than glory stared at the Mongol camps and wondered if desertion was really such a dishonorable choice. By February 5th, everything was ready. The siege engines were assembled, their counterweights tested, their crews drilled until they could load and fire in their sleep. The assault troops were positioned, knowing exactly which wall sections they would strike the moment the bombardment created a breach. The sappers had finished their undermining work, planting support timbers beneath key wall sections that would burn when the order came, dropping stone into rubble. Hulagu stood on a hill overlooking Baghdad and saw not a city but a problem to be solved. He had done this before. He would do it again. The mathematics were simple. Apply sufficient force to specific points, wait for structural failure, enter and process the population with maximum efficiency. The screaming was irrelevant. The begging changed nothing. This was engineering. Inside the walls, the Caliph prayed for a miracle that wouldn't come. Outside, the Mongols prepared to teach the Islamic world a lesson it would remember for centuries. The last night of peace settled over Baghdad like a funeral shroud. At dawn, the drums would begin, then the stones, then the screaming. The first stone flew at dawn on February 6th. 200 pounds of carefully selected granite, launched from a Chinese-designed counterweight trebuchet, arcing through the grey morning sky with mathematical precision. It struck the northeastern wall section with a sound like thunder trapped in a barrel. Stone dust exploded from the impact point. The wall held, but a spiderweb of fresh cracks radiated outward from where ancient mortar had failed under modern physics. Then the second stone flew. Then the third. Within an hour, a dozen siege engines were firing in coordinated rhythm, their crews working with the efficiency of men who had done this in Samarkand, in Nishapur, in a dozen cities whose names were now synonyms for annihilation. Every 4 minutes, another impact. Every impact, another section of wall weakened. The sound was constant, relentless, a drumbeat that announced the end of everything Baghdad had been. Here's where it gets insane. The Mongols weren't firing randomly. Chinese engineers had surveyed the walls, identifying the oldest sections, the places where previous repairs showed in different coloured stone, the spots where foundations sat on softer ground. Every projectile was aimed at a specific weakness. This wasn't bombardment. This was surgery with rocks. By noon of the first day, visible damage scarred the northeastern ramparts. Stones that had stood for 4 centuries now showed gaps wide enough to see daylight through. Defenders rushed to patch the breaches with whatever they could find: timber, rubble, even furniture dragged from nearby homes. But you can't repair in hours what took years to build properly, and the Mongol stones kept flying. The psychological warfare began even before the walls cracked. Mongol warriors rode close to the fortifications, just outside arrow range, dragging captured villagers behind their horses. The prisoners screamed until Mongol sabers silenced them, their bodies left to rot where defenders could see them clearly. The message was simple. This is what awaits you. Surrender now, or die later after we've had our fun. At night, the drums started. Deep war drums that resonated in your chest, that made sleep impossible, that promised horrors waiting just beyond the darkness. And between the drum beats, silence. Complete, absolute silence. Thousands of warriors making no sound at all except for the rhythmic thunder that counted down the hours until the walls failed. Baghdad's garrison tried to respond with sorties, desperate cavalry charges meant to break up the siege engine crews, to buy time for repairs, to show some spark of defiance. They were amateurs, charging professionals. Mongol light cavalry saw them coming from half a mile away, formed up with practiced ease, and turned the sorties into target practice. Composite bows with 60-pound draw weights sent arrows through mail armor at 300 yards. Horses screamed and fell. Riders who survived the arrows met Mongol sabers wielded by men who had been killing since childhood. One captain, a man named Rashid who had earned his position through actual combat experience rather than family connections, led 80 horsemen out the western gate at dawn on the 3rd day. They made it 200 yards before the arrow storm began. Rashid himself took 3 shafts, shoulder, thigh, and one that punched through his helmet and scraped along his skull without quite killing him. He made it back to the gates with 19 men. The rest decorated the killing ground, their bodies retrieved by Mongol warriors who stripped them of anything useful and left the corpses for the ravens. The walls began to fail on February 8th. The northeastern section, pounded by focused bombardment for 3 days straight, developed a crack that ran from foundation to battlement. Mongol sappers, working at night under cover of darkness and the constant drum thunder, reached the wall's base and began their patient work. They dug beneath the foundations, replacing earth with timber supports, packing the space with oil-soaked kindling. At dawn on February 9th, they lit the fires. Stone doesn't burn, but it cracks when the earth beneath it shifts. The timber supports turned to ash. The undermined section settled, then tilted, then collapsed inward with a roar that could be heard across the entire city. 40 feet of wall that had stood since the reign of Caliph al-Mansur, 500 years of history, became a sloping ramp of rubble leading directly into Baghdad's streets. The defenders rushed to plug the gap, but here's what makes this truly extraordinary. The Mongols didn't immediately assault through the breach. They had learned patience in 100 sieges. Let the defenders exhaust themselves building hasty barricades. Let them waste arrows on probing attacks. Let fear do the work that steel would finish later. Instead, Hulagu's engineers diverted the Tigris. The dam they had built upstream, invisible to the city's defenders, was opened. Water that should have flowed past Baghdad's eastern walls was channeled into the defensive ditches the garrison had dug months earlier, trusting in muddy obstacles to slow any assault. The ditches became lakes. The ground around them became swamp. Defenders who had positioned themselves in earthworks found themselves standing in freezing water, their defensive positions transformed into traps. By February 10th, 5 major breaches scarred the walls. The bombardment continued with mechanical precision, each stone widening the gaps, each impact sending more dust into the air until a grey haze hung over the city like funeral smoke. The garrison had lost perhaps 2,000 men to Mongol arrows, disease, and simple desertion. Men slipped over the walls at night, choosing to take their chances with Mongol patrols rather than wait for whatever horror awaited when the gates finally opened. Inside Baghdad, the illusion of divine protection was dying harder than the defenders. Imams preached from mosques that God would intervene at the final moment. Miracles were promised, prophesied, desperately hoped for. But the walls kept crumbling, and the Mongol camps kept growing, and the sky remained stubbornly empty of angelic hosts, descending to smite the infidels. The Caliph, watching from his palace as sections of his capital crumbled under Chinese engineering, finally began to understand the mathematics of his situation. No relief force was coming. The other Muslim powers, occupied with their own survival and internal politics, had left Baghdad to face the storm alone. The garrison was melting away through casualties and desertion. The walls, once symbols of permanence and strength, were becoming piles of convenient rubble for Mongol assault troops to climb. On February 11th, al-Mustasim sent new negotiators to Hulagu's camp. Perhaps surrender terms could still be arranged. Perhaps the killing could be minimized. Perhaps some face-saving arrangement existed that would preserve the Caliphate's dignity while acknowledging Mongol superiority. The negotiators carried offers of tribute, promises of cooperation, desperate pleas wrapped in diplomatic language. Hulagu received them with the courtesy due to men about to die. He listened to their proposals. He nodded at appropriate moments. Then he explained the new terms: unconditional surrender. The Caliph would present himself at the Mongol camp personally. The city would open all gates immediately. The garrison would stack arms and submit to Mongol authority. These were not negotiating positions. These were instructions. The negotiators returned to Baghdad carrying Hulagu's final message: comply by dawn on February 13th, or the assault would begin in earnest, and mercy would no longer be offered even to those who begged for it. The Caliph had less than 2 days to choose between humiliation and annihilation. Inside the city, people began to pray in ways they never had before. Not the formal prayers of Friday services, but the desperate bargaining of those who suddenly realized that God might not intervene after all. Markets emptied. Streets filled with refugees carrying whatever they could, fleeing toward the center of the city as if distance from the walls would somehow protect them from what was coming. The Mongol camps remained eerily silent through the night of February 12th. The drums stopped. The war cries ceased. In the terrible quiet, defenders strained their ears and heard something worse than threats. They heard Mongol warriors sharpening blades, thousands of blades, the whisper of steel on stone, rhythmic, patient, preparing for work that would begin when the sun rose. Al-Mustasim spent that final night in prayer and delusion. His advisors still whispered that resistance might yet succeed, that the Mongols might withdraw, that this was all some elaborate negotiating tactic. But in his heart, the Caliph knew. 500 years of Abbasid rule was ending. The only question left was how many would die screaming before the silence fell. At dawn on February 13th, the gates of Baghdad opened from within. The Caliph walked out through the western gate, surrounded by his closest advisors, his family, and the last shreds of dignity a doomed ruler could muster. Al-Mustasim wore his finest robes, believing somehow that appearance might matter to men who measured worth in horses and steel. Behind him, the garrison stacked their weapons in piles that grew like funeral pyres, swords, spears, bows that would never be drawn again, 20,000 men surrendering to the inevitability they should have faced weeks ago. Hulagu Khan received the Caliph with courtesy that fooled no one. Tea was served. Proper words were exchanged. Al-Mustasim was escorted to a tent and told to wait while the Mongol commander attended to the city. The Caliph sat in silk cushions, drinking tea, still believing that surrender meant survival. He had no idea he was already a dead man waiting for his execution to be scheduled. The Mongols entered Baghdad in disciplined columns, not as a conquering mob, but as workers arriving at a job site. They had done this before. They knew exactly what came next. The city was divided into sectors, each assigned to specific units. Every neighborhood, every street, every building would be processed with the efficiency that had made the Mongol Empire unstoppable. The killing began methodically. Mongol troops moved block by block, house by house. Doors were kicked open, families dragged into the streets, men separated from women, women from children. Not from mercy, just organization. Different groups would be processed in different ways. The systematic slaughter of 1 million people requires planning. Here's where your history teacher stopped talking, because what happened next defies comfortable narrative. The Mongols killed with the emotional investment of farmers harvesting wheat. No rage, no hatred, just work that needed completing before nightfall. Sabers rose and fell. Mongol veterans who had done this in a dozen cities moved through their tasks with practiced efficiency. Speed mattered more than cruelty. Suffering was incidental. Death was the goal. The numbers grew with terrible arithmetic. Hundreds became thousands. Thousands became tens of thousands. By nightfall of February 13th, conservative estimates placed the dead at over 50,000. The streets ran with blood that pooled in low spots and attracted flies in swarms that darkened the afternoon sun. The smell began on the second day, a stench of death, so overwhelming that Mongol troops tied cloth over their faces while they worked. But wait, it gets worse. The House of Wisdom, repository of human knowledge that had survived 2 centuries of crusades and political upheaval, was torched on February 14th. Mongol soldiers who couldn't read a single character of Arabic or Persian or Greek threw manuscripts into bonfires with the same casual efficiency they brought to killing. 5 centuries of accumulated scholarship, mathematics that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe for 300 years, medical texts, astronomical charts, poetry, philosophy, all reduced to ash in a single afternoon's work. Survivors reported the Tigris River running black with ink from dissolved manuscripts, then red with blood from bodies thrown into the current. Historians argue about the exact sequence, but the image haunted Islamic chroniclers for centuries. Knowledge and life flowing together into the Persian Gulf, the center of civilization bleeding out through its own river. The library burning wasn't vandalism driven by religious hatred. Hulagu's own wife was Nestorian Christian, and he had given orders to spare Christian churches and populations. This was strategic cultural destruction. Break the symbols, and you break the spirit of resistance for generations. Show that even the most sacred repositories of knowledge can burn, and what faith can survive the lesson. Individual vignettes emerge from the horror, glimpses of humanity crushed under systematic genocide. A scholar named Ahmad al-Dahabi was found by Mongol soldiers clutching a manuscript on Ptolemaic astronomy, his life's work translating and commenting on Greek mathematical texts. He begged them to spare the book, if not his life. A Mongol veteran, who had killed men in China and Persia and couldn't tell one scroll from another, used the manuscript to start a fire that burned the scholar's home. Ahmad died watching his work become kindling. His last words, recorded by a survivor hiding nearby, were prayers not for his soul but for the knowledge lost. Families hid in basements, in attics, in spaces between walls where they huddled in darkness, listening to screams grow closer. The Mongols, experienced in urban warfare, knew every trick. They burned buildings to flush out those hiding inside. They used prisoners as forced guides to reveal secret cellars. They brought dogs trained to smell human fear in confined spaces. Few hiding places remained secret for long. Young children were killed to prevent future revenge. Old men were killed because they were useless as slaves. Women were sorted by age and appearance, some taken as spoils, others executed with the same mechanical efficiency as their husbands and sons. The Mongols had calculated that Baghdad's population was too large to control and too dangerous to leave alive. Genocide wasn't a war crime in their conception. It was sound military strategy. The horror stretched across 40 days. Not because the killing took that long, experienced Mongol troops could process thousands per day, but because Hulagu wanted completeness. Search teams moved through ruins multiple times. Bodies were counted to ensure quotas were met. Survivors found hiding were executed publicly to discourage others from attempting escape. The message had to be absolute. Resistance equals extinction. By March 20th, the screaming stopped. 1 million people had become corpses, smoke, and memory. The exact death toll remains debated by historians. Conservative estimates say 800,000. Others claim over 1 million. Medieval chroniclers, prone to exaggeration, reported numbers as high as 2 million. But the range of disagreement matters less than the undeniable fact that Baghdad, metropolis of 1 million souls, became a ghost city in 6 weeks. Caliph al-Mustasim watched his city die from Mongol captivity. He was forced to reveal where the Abbasid treasury was hidden, a humiliation worse than death for a man who had believed himself God's chosen ruler. Hulagu's men extracted gold and jewels accumulated over 5 centuries of caliphate rule. Wealth that could have ransomed kingdoms was piled before a conqueror who already had more treasure than he could count. Then came the execution that would echo through Islamic history for centuries. Hulagu had promised to spare the caliph's life, technically. Mongol tradition forbade spilling royal blood on the ground, so they wrapped al-Mustasim in carpets and trampled him to death under horses' hooves. No blood spilled, no oath broken, just a spiritual leader of millions reduced to broken meat inside Persian rugs. The last Abbasid Caliph died hearing his own bones crack, his final breath a scream swallowed by silk and screaming horses. The irony was lost on no one. The man who believed divine protection would save Baghdad died in a manner designed to avoid technically breaking a promise. The Mongols understood symbolism as well as they understood siege engineering. The manner of death mattered as much as the fact of it. Show the Muslim world that even the Caliph can be trampled like a common criminal, and resistance becomes psychologically impossible. Hulagu gave orders to spare the Christian population. His Nestorian wife had advocated for mercy toward her co-religionists, and Hulagu saw strategic value in showing that cooperation could bring survival. Churches were marked and protected. Christian families huddled inside while the slaughter raged beyond their walls, survivors by accident of marriage alliances and Mongol political calculation rather than divine intervention. The rest found no mercy. By late March, Baghdad was silent in ways that disturbed even veteran Mongol warriors. Cities, after conquest, usually retained some life, survivors emerging from hiding, refugees returning to salvage what remained. Baghdad stayed empty. The smell of death hung so thick that travelers reported detecting it from miles away. Ravens and wild dogs feasted until they grew fat and lazy. The jewel of Islam had become a tomb where even scavengers eventually found the pickings too grim to sustain. Smoke from the burning libraries had been visible for 300 miles, travelers claimed. Whether literally true or psychologically accurate, the image captured something essential. The fire that consumed the House of Wisdom announced to the world that knowledge, faith, and 5 centuries of accumulated civilization meant nothing against cold Mongol efficiency. The silence that fell over Baghdad in late March, 1258, was the sound of an empire learning terror. News of Baghdad's fall reached Cairo like a plague wind. The messenger arrived at the Mamluk court exhausted, having ridden hard through territory, suddenly feeling exposed and vulnerable. His report was received in silence broken only by sharp intakes of breath. The Caliph dead, Baghdad destroyed. 1 million souls erased in 40 days. The center of Islamic civilization reduced to corpses and ash. If Baghdad could fall, if even the spiritual leader of Islam could be trampled under Mongol hooves, then what city was safe? What ruler could sleep without dreaming of Chinese siege engines and methodical slaughter? Sultan Qutuz of Egypt listened to the report and felt the weight of history shifting. The Mamluks, former slave soldiers who had seized power in Egypt, now found themselves inheritors of a burden they had never sought. With the Abbasid Caliphate destroyed, with Baghdad silent, the defense of Islam fell to whoever had the courage and strength to stand against the Mongol tide. Cairo began preparing for war with the desperation of men who had seen the future, written in Baghdad's ruins. Damascus heard the news and surrendered before Mongol scouts even approached their walls. The lesson was clear. Resistance brought annihilation. Submission brought survival, even if survival meant humiliation and tribute. City after city along Hulagu's path chose existence over honor, opening gates rather than face what Baghdad had endured. The psychological impact rippled faster than Mongol horses could ride. In Delhi, the Sultan of the Delhi Sultanate received reports that made his advisors pale. The Mongols had reached the gates of Islam's heartland and kicked them down. If they turned east instead of continuing toward Egypt, nothing stood between the Mongol horde and India except distance and desire. Defensive preparations began immediately. Treaties were signed with minor kingdoms that had been enemies the week before. Terror made allies of former rivals. Persian chroniclers, writing years later with hands that still shook at the memory, struggled to find words adequate to the horror. Rashid al-Din, who served the Mongol Ilkhanate and had access to their records, documented the fall of Baghdad with clinical precision that made the brutality more disturbing rather than less. He recorded casualty estimates, described the systematic nature of the killing, detailed the library burning with the sorrow of a scholar mourning knowledge that would never be recovered. His accounts remain primary sources, testimony from a man who understood exactly what had been lost. Ibn Kathir, writing from Damascus, called the fall of Baghdad the greatest catastrophe ever to befall Islam. His chronicles described refugees arriving in Syria with stories that seemed impossible yet proved horrifyingly accurate. Whole families executed, libraries burned, the Tigris running black and red, the Caliph wrapped in carpets and trampled like an animal. These weren't legends or exaggerations. They were eyewitness accounts from survivors who had watched their world end in blood and smoke. Archaeological evidence confirms the medieval chronicles weren't inflated by trauma and distance. Modern excavations in Baghdad have uncovered mass graves from the period, layers of bodies showing signs of violent death, buried hastily without the ritual washing and proper orientation toward Mecca that Islamic law required. The evidence suggests death on such scale that religious burial became impossible, that corpses were simply piled and covered before disease could spread further. The bones don't lie about how they died or how many died together. Here's what makes this truly extraordinary. Baghdad never recovered. Not in decades, not in centuries. A city of 1 million became a provincial town of perhaps 50,000 within a generation. The trade routes that had made it wealthy shifted to avoid the ruins. The libraries were never rebuilt with anything approaching their former glory. Scholars who survived scattered to Cairo, Damascus, distant courts where their knowledge might find new patrons. The intellectual center of the Islamic world had been decapitated, and the body never grew a new head. The before and after comparison haunts historians. Before February 1258, Baghdad was arguably the greatest city on earth, rivaling or surpassing Constantinople, Cairo, and any city in China for wealth, population, and cultural achievement. After March 1258, it was a graveyard that travelers avoided, a cautionary tale whispered by mothers to frighten children into obedience. The transformation took 40 days. The recovery never came. Strategic consequences rippled for generations. The Mongol advance continued towards Syria and Egypt, but Hulagu's forces were stretched thin, maintaining control over the conquered territories. When Munka Khan died in 1259, Hulagu withdrew most of his troops to participate in the succession crisis, leaving only a reduced force to continue the western campaign. The Mamluks, emboldened by the Mongol withdrawal and desperate to prove that resistance was possible, met the remaining Mongol force at Ain Jalut in 1260. The Battle of Ain Jalut became the first significant Mongol defeat, proof that the seemingly unstoppable could be stopped by disciplined troops fighting on favorable terrain with competent leadership and desperate motivation. But Ain Jalut doesn't erase Baghdad. The victory came too late, purchased with knowledge of what happened when cities fell. The Mamluks fought with the fury of men who knew exactly what awaited defeat, and that knowledge came from Baghdad's corpses. Why did this siege terrify the Muslim world more than other Mongol conquests? Because Baghdad was different. Samarkand was wealthy, Nishapur was populous, but Baghdad was symbolic. The Caliph resided there. The House of Wisdom represented Islamic achievement. 5 centuries of continuous rule gave the Abbasid Caliphate an aura of permanence that even the Crusades hadn't seriously threatened. When Baghdad fell, when the Caliph died trampled like livestock, the psychological foundation of Islamic civilization cracked. It proved that no city was sacred enough to be spared. No spiritual authority was respected by men who worshipped different gods and valued efficiency over faith. The Mongols didn't just conquer territory. They demonstrated that everything Muslims believed protected them. Their numbers, their faith, their cultural achievements meant nothing against cold calculation and Chinese siege engines. Modern military analysts study the siege of Baghdad for lessons that remain relevant. How do you destroy not just an enemy's military, but their will to resist? How do you make an example so horrifying that others surrender without fighting? The Mongols understood psychological warfare centuries before the term existed. They cultivated terror as deliberately as engineers cultivate precision. Baghdad was proof of concept, demonstration that systematic genocide could be military policy rather than war crime. Comparisons to other historical catastrophes illuminate what made Baghdad unique. The sack of Rome in 410 shocked the classical world, but Rome's population was perhaps 200,000, and many survived. Hiroshima in 1945 killed comparable numbers in an instant, but the technology was unprecedented rather than the systematic application of existing methods. Baghdad combined massive scale with methodical execution, genocide accomplished through organization rather than innovation, horror multiplied by bureaucratic efficiency. The Islamic Golden Age, which had produced algebra, advanced astronomy, preserved Greek philosophy, pioneered medicine and chemistry, didn't end on a specific date. Cultural movements don't die cleanly. But if you needed a symbolic tombstone, February through March 1258 would serve. The knowledge lost in Baghdad's libraries was never fully recovered. The scholars scattered, never reformed into comparable institutions. The confidence that Islam represented progress and civilization died in the realization that progress and civilization could burn just as easily as ignorance and barbarism. Hulagu Khan completed his mission. He broke Islam's heartland so thoroughly that unified resistance became impossible. The Muslim world fragmented into regional powers, each looking to its own survival rather than coordinated defense. The Mongol Ilkhanate would rule Persia and Mesopotamia for another century, a constant reminder of what happened to those who resisted. The terror lasted longer than the conquest. 5 centuries of books became ash in an afternoon. 1 million souls became corpses in 40 days. The center of the world became a tomb that travelers avoided for generations. Hulagu Khan achieved what other conquerors had only dreamed. He didn't just defeat an enemy. He taught an entire civilization to fear memory itself. They came to conquer a city. They killed a civilization. The smoke from Baghdad's libraries darkened the sky for weeks, and the Islamic world never stopped smelling the ash. When empires build their power on the myth of divine protection, sometimes all it takes is 40 days of systematic slaughter to shatter the illusion entirely. The Muslims learned terror in Baghdad. The lesson has never been forgotten.